Welcome to the second week of our online book discussion group about the 5 Invitations by Frank Ostaceski. We have a lot of material this week, not in terms of pages necessarily, but in terms of Dhamma themes. So just looking at this week's reading, we have the topic of childhood deaths and our feeling about the timeliness or untimeliness of people's deaths, the theme of acceptance, sexual abuse and clergy misconduct, love and metta, and assisted suicide was briefly mentioned in there, and dukkha in general, suffering or unsatisfactoriness. So we have a lot of big topics, and I think last week the request was, rather than to do a recap, we would just start out where you would like to start. So how about if we do that again, given what we have before us?
I have a comment on early death and an experience with that. So my husband died 9 years ago at 61. He was hale and hearty as far as we knew. It was totally unexpected. It was a heart attack, but he hadn't had any known symptoms. So he was backpacking and hiking and everything right up until the night that he died. And of course it was a severe loss and shock and everything else. But when I think about it, in the 9 years of aging that I've experienced, and all my friends and family are experiencing, all our aches and pains and illnesses and this and that, decrepitude creeping in. I'm thinking, I know that the lists, if you act this way in this lifetime, then this is going to be your karmic result. And so there's something, I think, negative that's associated with maybe early death. But I'm thinking, I'm not so sure that early death is a negative thing. Like my husband was able to live his life to the fullest. And then pop out with very little. I think he had a few hours of pain when he was having this heart attack, but then they did a stent that was relieved. And then he was happy because he thought he was coming home, like he was happy, and then died in his sleep. His heart stopped in his sleep, so he never made it back home. But I thought, to me, it was a karmically very good death, because there was no fear or pain or discomfort. He lived life to the fullest, didn't have to experience all these aches and pains of old age. And so I'm kind of changing my mind about early death.
Well, and actually, Sangamita, lots of folks wouldn't consider 61 to be early. I think that's in the Western world, we would maybe consider that to be relatively early, but there are lots of places in the world where 61 is a good ripe old age. And yes, mercifully easeful of a very quick kind of unexpected death like that for the person who goes, and of course much harder, much more impact on the folks who are left behind. I mean,
maybe and maybe not, because a lot of my friends have supported their spouses or parents or whatever dying of like protracted illnesses like cancer, and that takes a huge toll on the loved ones left behind. So yes, I mean, it's a shock, and it's a horrible shock at the moment it happens, but when you think about it, it can be less of a toll on the person left behind than some of these more chronic illnesses.
True. Yes, very true. Yeah, and I was speaking with a Zen priest friend of mine, Charlie Picorni, a couple of years back, when we were talking a little bit about this Dhamma teaching of the karma of a short life, and his daughter had died. He had an infant daughter who had died at about how old was she? Dear one. She was about 3 at the time that she passed. And in talking with him about it, you know, I didn't necessarily share his view of it, which was something like, you know, life is so fragile that it's just almost random, that it could just happen. It could happen almost, you know, in a sort of instant way. And I didn't share that view, but what I did actually come to later on was something like, when that person is gone, and now I'm not sure if we talked about this last week, when someone dies, in retrospect, we can look at that and say, okay, the karma of that body and mind was done. It was complete. And then that karmic stream moves on to another situation. That's the teaching of the 12-fold chain of dependent causation, right? That has played itself out, so to speak, that karma in this form to the extent that it could, and then it's done. It has to have happened in that way. And from our perspective, we don't know that. We have our ideas about it should be longer, or it should have been like this, or it should have been like that. But that's because we don't really see the full karmic picture.
You remind me of a book written by a man who was, I think, a psychiatrist, who had a baby daughter who was born with some, I believe it was a daughter, it could have been a son, born with some genetic horrible thing, that the child lived, I don't know how many months, and months that were very, very difficult. And it was very difficult for him and for his wife. Years later, in interviewing a patient who supposedly had some sort of psychic abilities, she referred to this child, and he had no idea how she could know about the child. And what she said to him was, the child was a bodhisattva, took that life so that he learned the compassion that had informed his life from then on. And it blew my mind to read that. And apparently the patient was not Buddhist, didn't know what the word "datta" meant, was just using it because it had come to her. If I can figure out, if I remember the book, I will put it in the online discussion thing, because it's fascinating.
It is fascinating. That's exactly the word I was going to use. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, so the timeliness is something, though, that I think is one of the greatest difficulties that we have with death. Our sense of whether it's a timely death or not a timely death, and whether we're okay with it, whether we're okay with the timing that's happening. I just came from the hospital, actually. On Sunday night, I was visiting a friend of mine, a 42-year-old man who I had met at Tassajara, and we'd done a couple of practice periods at Tassajara together. And he's in the hospital dying of pancreatic cancer. He's got maybe, I would say probably he has less than a week to go. And yeah. And so that's, I don't think so much for his father and his wife, but for himself, his own idea of dying too young. It's a great burden. It's a very, very great burden for him. But certainly kids, children, you know, we feel like the natural cycle of life is that the children are supposed to, that the parents are supposed to die before the children.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always happen that way.
No. Many times it does not happen that way.
Yeah, I had a sister who I still have this lovely sister. In fact,
Mhm.
I have the experience of knowing that my sister has had 5 miscarriages.
Mm.
That's a lot of miscarriages. She also has 4 lovely children, and
Mm.
one of her youngest child, who's now 15, had a terrible rare infection called, I think it was called the forgotten disease. It's something that
Hmm.
if it's not diagnosed right, you'll die. And she was in and out of the hospital 4 times, and this young woman was saying, "I just want to die. I'm in so much pain and so much discomfort." But they had a doctor who came by and says, "Oh wait, I think this may be this disease." But I remember really being struck by the toughness of my sister in the face of that.
Mm.
And I wonder sometimes because I've never really discussed with her experience with that kind of loss of an anticipated life that doesn't happen. It's another kind of death. And I also, I was, it's a little weird to be smiling in the face of death. Maybe you're telling a joke about it, but life, I was thinking, here we're discussing people who die too soon. And I was talking last time about old Joe, who feels like he's lived too long and he's not
Yes.
dying soon enough.
Yes.
And I'm thinking to
That too.
myself, like the Woody Allen joke,
Yes.
that life is a bit like going to that, the people who go to the restaurant and say, the food here is just awful. And the portions are so small. Complaining. Either way, it's not going to be right for us, right?
Yes. Yes.
So that's...
Actually, there's another Woody Allen joke about the timeliness of death. Maybe he's very morbid. I don't know, because I don't really follow him. But
strange man. We know this much.
This for sure. My goodness.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But anyway, he says, you can eat healthy and quit drinking and stop smoking, and you might not live longer, but it will surely feel like it.
That's very good.
Yeah.
I don't know. We want explanations,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And
Yes.
certainly the people who are going through these things, that's one of the things I've heard people say, is why now? And it's something that we ask. Why did my father decide to die while I was out of town? I'd always had this hope that I could be with Dad, when he died. Well, it didn't happen that way. But, But I guess so. Then again, it's like, how do you work with the people who are around that kind of a situation, or your own feelings about it?
Dying while loved ones are not present. Frank mentions this in his book, and his advice to us is to give dying people some quiet or alone time, and yeah, so I think he actually addressed that, didn't he? That it may not be just happenstance that they die when you go to the bathroom or die to run out to get a snack. That they be waiting for that moment to be able to disconnect and then let go.
Yes, it's true. Some people, in my experience in hospice in particular, I would say it was very clear to me that there were some people who were waiting for a moment alone. They were absolutely waiting for that time in the middle of the night when the nurse would go away and the family members would go away, and they just had their own quiet time. And conversely, there were people who were waiting for someone to arrive.
Show up.
Even if they're unconscious. There were some people who very clearly were waiting for the grandchild or somebody else to show up.
Yeah, I had a kind of funny experience like that when I was a kid. I was probably maybe, well, I always use 8 years old, so I don't know why, if I was really 8 years old or not, but my uncle, my aunt, Auntie Lee, had one of the first kidney transplants at the University of Minnesota. So she lived for a long time for some, but she still, you know, she died relatively early in her age. And so my uncle, my other uncle came into town, and he and I went out to the hospital to visit. Her husband, my Uncle Bill, had been with her and sleeping in the room and everything. So he finally had a reprieve, and he went out, and my uncle and I were there. And then my Uncle Bill called on the phone, and I said, I don't know, she looks the same. And then before he came back, she died.
Mm. Yes. Yes.
It kind of shook me up a little bit, because I was just like, whoa, I said she was okay.
Well, and it can be, I mean, and that's another thing, right? So death can be quite agonizing, and a lot of suffering, and a lot of thrashing about, and a lot of blood and other things happening. And other deaths can be just incredibly quietly slipping away. You exhale and you just don't inhale again. You know?
Mhm.
It's very, very interesting. But I want to go back to something you said, Genku, because it made me think also about how interesting it is that Frank writes about hope, you know, because part of what's painful about, for example, if your sister's daughter had died as a teenager, then, you know, part of what's painful for the survivors and for your sister at that point, most likely would have been something about the loss of her potential, the loss of the hopes and aspirations that you had for her as a person, you know, as a human being who has the potential to unfold their lives and have all kinds of impacts on the world. And yet, Frank is saying something about retaining a kind of hope that is about a willingness to be in the present moment, to hope for a now, actually, to hope for a now that has meaning and has some presence and has some acceptance in it. This is what I think he was talking about in part of that section on acceptance.
But what I understood, I loved that. I really, really loved that section where he talked about the difference between expectations and hope.
Mm-hmm.
What I took from the hope part was like hoping that we, can just be in the moment and be accepting, and, you know, basically be able to deal with whatever arises.
Mm-hmm.
And I just loved that. I thought it was a great.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's very good advice. And as he says in the book, it's very difficult, actually. Very, very difficult when you are facing your last days of your life to be really accepting that. If you know, if you have that luxury of knowing,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or difficulty of knowing, depending on how you look at it. Ken, Genku-san, did you want to add something?
I was trying to find a little section. I've got my Kindle version up on the machine, and
Oh, okay.
but there was something that struck me in that way, but now I can't find it right now. So that means it may have been so important that it buried itself, because it may have awakened something that would again put something in my eye, which these sections certainly did. I found these sections touching and tear-provoking.
Yes, yes, definitely. I thought so too. This set of this group of chapters was very poignant, very touching. Yes. And I found, and I'm not sure whether Frank actually drew this connection or not, but when he talks about being a teenager and being sexually abused by the priest, and
for years,
being able for years, and not being able to talk about it, not being able to bring someone else into that shame that he felt and that difficulty and that pain for a whole variety of reasons. The juxtaposition between that and the talk about acceptance was really sharp for me. Like that is right. If he had, and he's a child, so you can't fault him. Okay, right. Let's start with that. But that inability comes from not being able to accept the situation as it is and be able to accept whatever it is that would come as a response to saying the truth, right? And he's a child, so he can't really do that. You know, he can't bear whatever consequences he
No one would have believed him. He would not
Well,
have been believed.
and right. And so this is why people wait until their 40s or their 50s to talk about this abuse, because at that point then they are willing to state the truth and deal with the non-acceptance of the world, right? As children, they can't really do that. As children, it's impossible to say what you would just kind of be able to stand up to that kind of pressure from the adults in your life. But there was a very sharp, for me, it was in very sharp relief to this question of acceptance of what is.
I don't have a great deal of experience in my own life with that kind of abuse, or that kind of. I've certainly known people, and I think we probably all have, who've experienced some kind of trauma at the hands of another person, whether it's sexual trauma or physical trauma or emotional trauma. But I remember hearing, actually it was a podcast, and some women were talking about some political stuff related to sexual abuse and recounting their own story and saying why this is going to be hard for me to talk about because this had happened to me. And one of the things that they said that I found quite striking was that the process of being able to cope with that involved recognizing that they were not to blame. And I think that really rings a bell for me, and the folks that I know of who've had those kinds of experiences, that especially as a young person, you tend to internalize that in such a way that you say, well, I've done something to cause this. And rather than blame this other respected person who everyone says you're supposed to respect, so you're trying to respect them and trying to make sense out of this.
Yes.
So that I don't know that John talked about that in the book in quite that way.
I don't think so.
And I because I mean, as a gay man too, I mean, this sort of conflation of abuse, you know, and that often abuse comes with the mask of caring and love, and which is an incredibly damaging thing for people in their sort of sense of self and so on. So I found that whole thing particularly touching and worth a lot of thinking about and unpacking, as especially as I think I have some friends in my life right now who are still kind of unpacking that stuff now in late middle age, and still working with that past experience, and they see it cropping up in their own sort of daily life on a momentary basis, right? And it's one that's worth some thinking about.
Definitely. And a parallel could be drawn about abuse that happens in Dharma communities. Right?
Yeah.
Again, physical, sexual, emotional abuse that's happening at the hands of someone who is being held up as a role model, as somebody who should be respected, as somebody who, you know, is wiser than you, as somebody who is doing this, you know, for your own benefit ostensibly, or dharmic education or whatever. I mean, there are any number of horrifying ways in which it gets distorted and perverted. But yeah, similar situations, you know, that have been coming to light in Dharma communities, you know, gosh, for as long as I've been an adult, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely something to for us to think about, how to have some clarity around that, and how to without knowing who it is necessarily that's being impacted by that, how to actually support people. You know, I mean, that's for me, the kind of question that comes up. Because just like him, right? Nobody knew that Frank's priest was molesting him. And yet somehow they were creating a container for that to happen, and totally inadvertently.
The defense in Connecticut by the Monsignor, who was not himself accused, but priests under him were that the boys seduced the priests.
Yeah.
The whole thing was so perverted that it was very, very difficult for those of us outside the church to understand it all. And those within the church were absolutely apoplectic.
Oh, yes. Yes. It's just like unbelievable. Unbelievable. Yeah. That somebody could even actually say that.
Think that.
Think
Yes.
that.
Right.
Wow. Wow. Deep delusion. I mean, when we talk about extreme levels of delusion, really, really. Mm.
But I wanted to go back to something, is it Genpo? Is that the right?
Genku.
Genku.
Yes.
Genku said about his sister and the potential loss of the future of the niece. I had a friend whose 18-year-old daughter was hit by a drunk driver and the girl was killed instantly. And she said to me, it's not so much that we lost our daughter's life. We lost her whole future.
Yes.
We lost her marriage. We lost her our grandchildren. So what she was saying, as I heard it, was you lost all those expectations that were part of it. And those expectations are delusions in a way, and we all live in them, very solidly in them. Mm-hmm. So that when the child is born, a certain expectation of a future is there, and it's rock solid.
Yes.
And with the death, it's gone. The whole package is gone. Yeah. So an untimely death causes the loss of what was not, what didn't exist, except in our minds. Mm-hmm. But it's very real in our minds.
Yes, the hopes and the dreams. And contrast that with Ajahn Chah, right? The story, the very, very, very well-known in Theravada circles, certainly, story of Ajahn Chah saying, I know the glass will be broken at some point. I know this glass is already broken. Therefore, I can enjoy it now. And when I knock it off the table with my elbow or it falls on the ground or whatever happens, I say, of course. I say, it had to be so. At some point or another, it had to be so. It's not a permanent object. Right? So this is a very high bar. This is the Dhamma is asking us a relatively high bar by saying, can we have that attitude about our loved ones, about our fellow human beings,
about ourselves,
Yes.
Well, where is that attitude though? It doesn't, for me, that doesn't say that you don't grieve the loss of that pretty glass.
Oh no,
of course.
At all.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
So that and when you're dealing with someone who's experiencing that, and maybe you have that perspective, and you sort of know that, well, this is in the nature of life at this moment, and seeking explanations is probably not going to get you out of your dukkha, out of your suffering. So then the question is, how do you meet that and be present for other people's sort of deluded. I want to make sure that I'm not saying that other people are deluded in their suffering. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. No.
I know we're not saying that, but I sometimes see people who try to do the right thing and use that sort of explanation to say that, well, or that it can be heard in such a way that it sounds like, well, you shouldn't be suffering. This is just, and I hear Christians doing this from time to time.
Oh yeah.
Well, you must, Jesus has taken them to a better place. Well, that was not a better place, laying in that bed suffering the way they were. That's, you know what I'm saying?
Yes. No, I hear exactly what you're saying. And that's, I think, one of the most insensitive things we can actually do is to tell people it's okay, or they're in a better place now, or any of that stuff, any kind of like trying to make it seem like a good thing, they're at peace now. We have no idea. We really
Yeah,
don't.
I don't know
We
that.
really don't know that for a fact. And that is a kind of dismissal that can happen. And yet, I will say, one of the conversations when the particular hospice organization that I was a chaplain for, the manager of the grievance, what was it called? Not grievance. It was called grief counseling. Thank you. The manager of grief counseling was a fellow Zen priest, and he had in the office, he would have, the family members. It was part actually of the whole process that we did with folks, that after someone died, they knew that they had access for a year actually to grief counseling and grief support groups and various other things through the hospice. And so my good friend would have the family members come in and meet with him there in the office. He had a private room for that purpose. But for whatever reason, he was having a conversation in the hallway with one of the family members that had arrived one particular day. Just like they started talking before they got to the room, kind of thing. And I was there also standing in the hallway, and he, introduced me as one of the chaplains and so on. And in any event, I kind of stayed there for the beginning part of their conversation. And what he did in that conversation was to somehow elicit that this person started by talking about exactly this. They started talking about the loss of their hopes and their dreams for their spouse. It was their spouse who had died. It was a man whose wife who had died. The loss of the hopes and the dreams and the future, and the waking up next to this person the next morning, and all of these parts of the future that he had envisioned, or that he really looked forward to, hoped for, dreamed for. And yet, as the conversation went on, somehow my friend, was able to elicit this reminder of all that they had had. Right? You did have 30-something years of mornings of waking up together. You did have the memories of this trip or that trip to the, and so he was able to sort of turn it from this sense of a loss of a thing that never really had happened and wasn't possible. We now know in retrospect wasn't going to happen, because that's how it was. But to see that he could actually, that person could, as we say, kind of live on in his memory, right? He still had all the memories, he still had all that love, and that didn't go away. That didn't go away. And in fact, that would continue to sustain him going forward. So that shift, I was like so impressed at how he could help this person make that shift, like just in the span of a few sentences of a conversation, like, oh yeah, and this part, I don't know how that was for you, Sangamita, when you lost your husband. Did you have to go through that process?
Well, I had a very interesting process. And this is probably the first major death I had, because my parents both died before I studied Buddhism and started practicing. And so this is probably the first major death. And what happened was, the first 2 days, I was consumed with sitting on the telephone and phoning everybody and telling them. And so every time I'd say, Andre has died, I'd burst into tears, tell them, and then stop that phone conversation, on to the next phone conversation, say, Andre died, burst into tears.
Do it again.
So that went on for 2 days. And then I finished. And then the next morning I woke up, and I was just in this unbelievable state of equanimity. Unbelievable. And And then at some point during the day, I had the thought like, boo-hoo, I've lost my best friend. And then immediately after that thought came in, another thought came in and said, this isn't helpful, and it stopped. And then a few hours later, boo-hoo, I've lost my best friend, this isn't helpful, stopped. And then that was it. That was it. I mean, yes, I had a few tears, I would say, for the next year and a half, if I saw like an older couple holding hands on the street. There'd be some tears, but there wasn't any sort of thinking. It was just, I would see this thing that I was not going to have, and there'd be, you know, like less than a minute of tears, and then after a year and a half that stopped. But I think somehow my Dhamma practice did something, you know, like none of this was planned. Like I always thought I'd die before him because I'm the one with medical issues, and he was, you know, healthy and strong. So this was totally unanticipated.
Yes.
And this is not something that I tried to do in my head. It's just I had this thought, this other thought came in. And when I talked to Ajahn Sona, my teacher, about this, he said, oh, well, this is the difference, you know, the 5 spiritual faculties and the 5 powers. He said, this is the difference between a faculty and a power, maybe for the mindfulness, because mindfulness remembers what's, you know, skillful or unskillful or whatever. Anyway, that was his comment when I shared that with him. But I'm extremely grateful for the, you know, for that fruit of the Dhamma stepping in at a very difficult time. And so, I mean, I had all kinds of friends accusing me of not grieving, and I don't believe that. You know, I went across Canada and scattered his ashes with, I think, 77 different families or, you know, groups of friends, and talked, you know, went through photo books and showed the video of the celebration. Like, you know, I certainly feel I grieved, but not, I mean, compared to a lot of my patients who had, you know, were probably suffering from abnormal grief, I feel the Dhamma allowed me to get off very lucky.
So to clarify, when you say your patients, you mean your psychotherapy patients?
Yeah, my patients have a psychiatry practice. Yeah.
Yes.
And
so
go
ahead. No, go ahead.
And then I did have one other experience that I think that really helped me to deal with his death. And that was that I had 3 totally unrelated people, all of them living in totally different like communities, widely separated. They don't know each other, nothing, but they said things to me. And then one of these persons was Ajahn Sona, and they gave me bits of information and things that I feel I was given the information that Andre is dwelling in the 5th sensory realm, and it makes sense. Very, very good person. But I must say that I'm, you know, I've told a lot of people that mudita saved me, you know, knowing, I feel that I got pretty clear message from these 3 totally unrelated people that he's there in this heavenly realm, and happy. And so being happy for him, being happy in this heavenly realm. So just automatically, I would dwell whenever he comes to mind. I think about all the things that we did together, you know, all the good times and whatever. So first of all, the Dhamma thing of coming in and not letting me dwell on boo-hoo, this, you know, we're not going to have a future. Plus the mudita just made it really clear sailing.
So you do feel that he's in a better place, actually?
I have that very strong belief. I mean, I certainly don't have any psychic abilities, and I don't know that for myself, but having these 3 different things said to me, I feel pretty convinced.
There you go. There you go.
And whether it's true or not, it's making me happy.
Right. It's compassionate because it's helping you live your life happily after his
Mhm.
death. So I interpret this statement by Ajahn Sona, but the difference between a faculty and a power, meaning something like that is the practice applied versus the capacity or the potential for practice.
Well, I
Is
heard
that
it.
how you're understanding it?
No, I understood it as this is when it goes from a faculty to a power. And actually, I just listened to a Dhamma talk by Ajahn Brahmali, and he said there's only one reference in the Pali Canon to the balas, the powers.
Mm-hmm.
So he said from the suttas, you can't figure out from the suttas what is the difference between the two.
Yes.
But from what Ajahn Sona said to me, I just took it to mean that's when it's like really strong, so like it had that strength to come in when 3 days after his death, and I'm thinking, boo-hoo, I've lost my partner. And then this immediate thought comes in and says, this is not helpful.
Mm.
And then it stops. That's pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So I just took it, maybe the other is, maybe the difference between some peace that we have when we're unawakened versus the peace that comes when you're awake. It's just like a major difference in strength.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
Okay.
that's how I
Right.
that's how I understood it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the one sutta reference is saying something like the power is the fully realized faculty.
Okay, and I don't have any realizations, but
No,
anyway,
not that kind of realization. The other kind of realization, right? Like we realize our plans to build a building means it comes into being, right?
Yeah, so it definitely came into being, the power. Yeah.
Yes.
That power of mindfulness to say this is not a helpful thought, and then it just goes without any willpower or effort or investigation or anything, just bang, gone.
Yeah, you just really believed it. You said it's not, you believe the part of you that said this is not a helpful thought. So I want to shift just for a second. Thank you for sharing that, Sangamita. Thank you. To, if folks are interested or willing to talk about this question of assisted suicide that Frank barely touches on in the book, but has become, at least in the Pacific Northwest, quite the topic of discussion, and is actually being done. So it's legal now in Oregon and Washington, I believe, state, and
The
potentially other.
numbers are not high, from what I've heard. The statistical numbers of its happening are not high.
Yeah.
But the fact that it's permitted is a great comfort. I had a friend whose mother was dying of a brain tumor, extremely uncomfortable, miserable. The nurses gave her a bottle with pain medicine and told her, do not exceed such and such a dosage or it will kill you. So effectively, she knew she could take her own life, and she chose not to. And the family was very grateful and felt that she was more relaxed because she had the control, even though she chose not to use it. But she had it. And this was in a state where it was not legal. So it wasn't that anybody was telling her to kill herself or telling her how to kill herself. They were saying, do not exceed this dosage.
Right. And even having a brain tumor, to give her that capacity of choice is very, very interesting.
She was compos mentis. She just was in a great deal of pain.
Okay.
And
Genku? Sorry, I think Genku was going to say something.
Excuse me. Yeah. Go ahead, and it'll come back. So there are two different ideas, and I also was up until 2 a.m. With a class, so I'm a bit foggier than usual, which is really saying something. So yeah, go on, and I'll jump in.
Okay.
Just really quickie. So when I was trained in medicine, so before, when I was an intern, before I went into psychiatry, and this is like long, long before assisted suicide was even, heard as a term. um, we, we offered pain medication, adequate pain medication to help people who were in pain, knowing full well that sometimes the doses we were using could
Kill
end
them.
a person's life.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so I would say that's probably being done for, has been done for
Forever.
Yeah, forever. Yeah.
Yeah.
I-
It is
I guess, yeah.
definitely a very fine line, at least in my experience in the hospital. It's a very fine line sometimes. You know, something as simple as the doctor will say, if we make this person comfortable enough that they're not awake, their respiration is going to go down to the point where they'll stop breathing eventually, very shortly, actually. Or that's a possibility, or, like that. Like it was, I would agree, Sangami, that's it, like sort of subtle way of enabling that. Genku, you wanted to chime in now?
Yeah, I live in South Carolina, and it's a very religious state. When people come visit from other countries, as they often do, we have a lot of foreign direct investment, factories building things, low wage kind of state with a lot of interest in the fact that we have people willing to work for low wages. People comment on the amazing number of churches that we have, and that's at once a real beautiful thing. People really are engaged with their spiritual practice, and people feel very, very strongly about things like abortion.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think South Carolina has even begun a conversation about assisted suicide. And I've come to understand my sister, who has lived through a number of miscarriages, is someone who feels very strongly about abortion, and her kids do too. This is something that's been passed on as a way of thinking about life in the world, so that you absolutely don't take a life. Absolutely. And I mean, when I remember taking Jukai and kind of working a bit on that not practicing killing precept, and recognizing that, there are lots of ways in which we kill things, kill time, or as Margaret so loved in such a nice little phrase the other day said, we get in the way of ourselves sometime, which is a kind of, if we can avoid that, we're also avoiding not killing that moment that we have a chance to participate in and be involved in. But for me, it's been a bit of it's a continual practice for me and a continual opportunity in living and working in a place where people would absolutely say one should never permit something like assisted suicide to happen. And having said that, I also know that when the situation arises, people can change their minds about these things. And providing that kind of agency, as you described, of a nurse saying, well, too much of this and you'll check out, you will die. I can't help but see that as a great kindness to people. Right? Whether or not there's a way to move the conversation in directions that are, I believe, more compassionate in a place like South Carolina becomes a tremendously important question, as the inability of, and this becomes a part of that political sort of discussion. How do you help people have an opportunity for that kind of agency? And what are sort of the Buddhist ethics about that? For me, it's not always such an easy question, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, surely it has a karmic consequence for that person, right? I mean, that's, as I understand it, the Buddhist teaching about suicide in general, not just suicide at the end of life, but suicide at any point, is that it has a karmic consequence for that person. And again, that is a karmic act, and it's doing what it's doing. And if you're going to have the consequences, well, then you're going to have the consequences. And if you make that choice, then you make that choice as you make any other karmic choice. Which, if you've taken the precepts, it would be breaking the first precept. But there you go. You know, it's still a choice.
Is it enough? Is it enough to say, well, there you go? See, this is quite interesting to me, and quite there's maybe this is the other comment, and maybe this puts a frame around it. I think in our particular moment in this world, living as most of us do in a very complicated kind of society with lots of people and lots of problems and lots of things going on, I don't know that we've lost touch with it, but I know that in other places in the world, when death is around, there are other things to be done that we don't do. And I'll tell a quick story about.
Yeah.
I'll tell a quick story. I'll give you an example. I had a lover and friend who died of AIDS, and was aware that he was dying, but wasn't sure that he was dying of AIDS, but he was very sure that he was dying. He was actually in great denial about dying from AIDS. And so I was able to be in China up until a day before his death, and he was intubated and no longer sentient. And I had to leave. But I was there with his parents, who were asking me, with my bad Chinese at the time, to help them make decisions, medical decisions about my friend. Should we intubate or not? And so I was very intimately involved with this happening, and I had some preparation. He had told me some weeks before that he felt that he was dying. He felt he was sick enough. He was going to make a reservation at the hospital so that he'd have a room, and he believed that he would probably die. He was very sick. He had pneumocystic pneumonia, one of the opportunistic infections that come along with untreated HIV. And the day before I left, the parents recognized that he was probably going to die. And in this very nice private hospital room, this young man had a very successful career and had some money, so he had a private hospital room. They brought in a wok, and they brought in paper money, and they brought in little paper cars and little paper things that he might need on his transition through whatever bardos that they believed in.
Yep.
They were sort of folk Buddhists, or folk, these weren't people who sat and studied Buddhism. They'd go to the temple and offer incense,
It's
all this
folk
beautiful
religion.
stuff.
Yes.
But it was such a beautiful moment. And a surprise too, to walk down the hallway and smell smoke, and to recognize that for the hospital staff, it was perfectly okay for this family to have a fire going on in the, in the room, right? It's not a big fire, but enough of a fire.
You'd never see that here. You'd never ever see that.
They opened the window, and people respected that moment and helped them with it, made sure that they were able to do that. And I think at that moment, my friend was not aware of what was happening, but we all were. And we were all, the hospital staff and me, and I'd been around China enough to know that once a year, around Oban time, around Halloween time, around All Saints time, and we see this in all religions. You know, I geek out on all this ritual stuff. That we have a time in the year when we think about death. We have a time in the year when we recognize the importance of our ancestors and think about what else there is besides this life that we do not know about. And we recognize it, and we mark it, and we provide an occasion for us to see and smell the burning stuff going up into the sky, right? So it becomes embodied in us. Just as talking on the phone, that was such a beautiful story. I'm getting something in my eye. When you talk about getting on the phone and doing that practice of saying, he has died, and weeping, and then putting down the phone, getting your list again and doing it again. Just like this, I saw this mom and this dad, and I remember her very clearly when she recognized, the moment when she recognized that he was going to die, she began to wail in that hospital in a
Oh.
very loud voice.
Mm.
No one tried to calm her.
Right.
No
right.
one tried to embrace her. They stepped back and let her scream in her very loud Chinese voice, "My baby is dying."
Yes.
Giving an embodied kind of, making that real at that moment.
Yes.
And I just think that an important part of our lives is missing when we don't have opportunities for that to happen. For us to, in a very public way, in a way that erases this business about, oh, this is something she's doing over there by grieving. No, we're all in that moment together, and to just be there for that. But then having those kind of tools that I think in many cases people have lost with that. And that's maybe one of the beauties about South Carolina. People do their funerals and they do their baptisms, and they do them collectively and often very loudly.
Yes, like New Orleans, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah,
New Orleans.
yeah,
You're
yeah.
going to have, I mean, talk about the people who originated the American, in my opinion, the American celebration of life, right? You're going to have a
Right.
big parade. You're going to
Yeah.
have horns and people throwing confetti, and,
Yep.
there's not going to be any question about acknowledging this and going forward with it. And I guess the thing is also, for going back to the question of the decision itself, the reason why that happens is because there is a sense of lessening the suffering, of cutting off the suffering.
Yeah.
Sometimes the suffering of fear, sometimes the physical suffering, sometimes the just not being able to deal with the unknown. I will tell you that on the flip side of what you're saying, not to argue with you at all, Genku, because I agree completely with what you're saying, that grief is sometimes more scary to people than
Right.
death.
Right.
Actually, being able to acknowledge the grief that comes, the anticipatory, what we called in chaplaincy, anticipatory grief,
Mm.
Can be even more scary for some folks than the death itself. But I will say, on the other side of this conversation is, during the New Year's retreat, myself and Ayananda Bodhi independently were approached by a woman who had been asked to attend the assisted suicide of a Dharma teacher in her community.
Mm.
And it was a big gathering, and there were about 30 people present, and this person had kind of orchestrated this and wanted people to come together and perhaps have a chance to say something, and then she did the various, injections and things that were supposed to make it happen, and it didn't happen right away. There was some complication, and there needed to be more medication administered, and so then that had to happen. And so anyway, it took a long time, and it was not a very pretty process, and people felt, this woman in particular felt that she was basically traumatized by having been at this person's suicide.
Right.
And because it was, again, somebody that she respected and somebody who had specifically requested her presence, then she was there. But it seemed, to me, in retrospect, just based on what she was saying about it, that it had been a harmful, situation for her. It was something that was causing her a lot of distress later on. This was like already about 4 months later that she was on this New Year's retreat and wanting to talk about it. So there's a complex web of relationships that are impacted by such a decision, obviously, and how that happens, how it plays out very, very publicly or not publicly. I remember being in the Alzheimer's unit of a local assisted living facility and having the head nurse of the unit say to me, you know, this, looking at the people here is a good argument for assisted suicide, for the availability of assisted suicide, because most of these people who knew that they were getting Alzheimer's, if they'd had the choice, might have made the choice not to be living the way they're living right now, where they're basically out of their minds and just living from one meal to the next, and they have, you know, they have nothing to live for, in her opinion. And I was kind of shocked as a you know, as a person who's there visiting with one of the patients in the unit. Even this man who absolutely had no recognition of anything, the university that he taught at for 32 years, you know, none. And still, I couldn't imagine that, you know, that he would have taken his life before getting to that point. But that's, his wife seemed to think that, yes, his wife said he would never have wanted to be this way. And still,
but
I
never
think
have wanted.
Exactly, that's his.
Never have wanted isn't now. Never have wanted, and you can't know the interior life of someone.
Right.
And I don't care, even if it's Terry Schiavo. I think we're called to not know.
Yes.
Which is difficult for a lot of people.
Yes, absolutely.
And to rest in that and be present in that, and that means general statements about what should or should not happen that don't take into account. Someone has died. What do I do? I'm going to get on the phone and cry. Someone is, you know, you have we all have the ability to give life and take life all the time. And we do it all the time. We do it when we eat. We do it when we walk, you know. The monk has the little jingly things on the staff to warn away the little animals, lest he might step on some unawares, but it'll happen. You'll step on a bug.
So often the Alzheimer's person who may want to do that reaches the point when it might have been appropriate to do,
and they couldn't,
and they can no longer do it.
That's right.
There's a book called Still Alice. That's a novel.
I remember that. Yeah.
But it's a woman who is in early Alzheimer's, and she makes the plans, but it's not doable. Both of my parents had Alzheimer's. I don't think either one of them would have wanted to end their lives as they did, but it was not my decision to be involved with. But my husband and I have discussed it.
One also has the ability to prolong life or not prolong life by the kind of care one offers. And a quick story of my dear friend Dominique, who's was married to really what he considered to be the great love of his life, and they were colleagues and worked together and lived their beautiful lives together and had two wonderful children. But this woman suffered from a very severe kind of occasional depression, and on several instances had come very near to ending her life. And my friend Dominique had pulled her away from that moment. And at one point, he tells the story that the suffering became so intense for her, and his awareness and intimacy with her was, he felt so close that he came to understand that his pulling her back was causing additional suffering in her life. And in a very conscious way, in a way that he and she had both agreed to, that if she were in that state again, and it were so bad that he felt and she felt the wise thing to do would be to allow her the agency to leave it alone. And he talks about that quite freely and quite openly. And then he also goes on to say, and you know, I was able to deal with that, be with that, and go on in my life. And now he has another person in his life who he also says is the great love of my life, and they're both the great love of his life. And I think it's, I think for a lot of people that may be difficult to hear.
Yes.
That non-intervention sometimes is a kind of great compassion. And it strikes me as a level of skill that I doubt that I would have, you know, that, or at least, I mean, I say that now, I don't know, maybe I would. Maybe I'd be able to get out of the way. He really got out of the way.
Yes. And so did she did
She
kill
died.
herself.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he's never given me, and I have no idea about the details of how that happened, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Whether he gave her a nudge out the window or what he did, or just gave her space, right?
Yeah.
Tough.
I mean, it all has karmic consequences. So
Yeah.
Staying, leaving.
But that's
this
great.
is the part that I always feel this is the part that I always feel hung up on, you know? So this man that I was seeing who didn't recognize his university where he taught for 32 years, and his wife said he never would have wanted to be this way. He probably, you know, should have, you know, would have, et cetera, et cetera. And I could only think to myself, you don't know the karma that he's created, that is the ripple effect of his life right now. You don't know actually what's happening. His presence here, whether it has a purpose, whether there's something else going on for you, for her, even for the wife, right?
Right.
Yes.
We don't have that capacity.
Or even for him internally.
Yes, exactly. We don't know what's happening inside his mind. He can't communicate anymore. For me, that's a really scary thing to also say, like, wow, how do you know he wouldn't want to be like this? Maybe he's in there thinking, it's okay, I'm getting a rest, you know? Or he's not thinking any of those things, and it's just being. So for me, there's always this uneasiness about thinking that, yeah, we know how to define what less suffering looks like.
Oh, that's one to write down.
Well, it's recorded, so you can always go back to it.
I will go back, because it'll, you know, this happens in Dharma talks with me. A beautiful gem will come and there'll be a little explosion. It's like, okay, where did it go? I want to get back to that moment. Sometimes it's fine to let that go, but other times it's worth coming back. Thanks for recording. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for allowing that to happen. And on that note, we are almost at our time, but Michaela wants to say something. So you're going to take yourself off mute. There you go.
Oh, yeah, I was thinking whether we could talk about euthanasia of animals next time, because it's slightly different situation, but I come in touch with that quite often. Yeah.
Yes.
Talk about what?
Your rabbits.
Yeah, not just rabbits. Yeah, I will show you.
Talk about what? I'm sorry, I couldn't quite
Euthanasia.
Euthanasia of animals, yeah. I have lots of animals.
With animals.
I have to decide, yeah. And it's slightly different type of scenario, because you have to decide for basically them, yeah.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask about that during this group. Yeah. So
I think that's a good topic for discussion. And I also want to say thank you to especially the three of you who are on the call today, Michaela and Genku and Margaret, for your engagement with the forum, because I'm really, really enjoying it. And I feel like the material that's been there has been really rich. And hopefully, Sangamita, you are figuring out how to get on there, or at least reading.
Well, the sign up worked. I didn't email you back because you told me you'd be offline with the Wi-Fi shut down.
Yeah.
So I can get to the conversation, but I can't see how to add. I can see how to reply to somebody else's, but it's a mystery to me how to add or start a new topic.
Right. I don't know. I'd have to go back and look at the settings. At one point, I had set it up such that people couldn't add a new topic. You could only reply to topics that are started, because as an administrator, I wanted to try to keep all of the things related to the class together. But now I'm seeing that there's a lot of content there. So maybe I will unlock that, and we could start different topics. That would be fine. But I wasn't sure. I thought, oh, it'd be a good idea to keep it all together. And now I see how much material there is there, and it just doesn't make sense now. We're already in week 2, and it's so long, like 30-something posts. So wonderful that you all took it up with such great gusto.
There's gusto. And I would have, one of the things, I know we're short on time, and so if it could come up, if not this time, later,
yes.
Metta practice, which I have very limited experience with, and I tried out this week after reading this and found it profoundly moving and had not done it before, and found it to be something helpful. So if others have had experience with that, if there isn't, and maybe it could be done offline, it could be done with the writing.
No, mental practice is, I think, one worth talking about. I mean, I've been doing mental practice myself for about 15 years. It's one of my favorite topics.
Good.
It's one of my favorite topics. So that gets a yes, 2 thumbs up. So we have 2 topics for next time, and maybe the 4 elements too. And we'll try to weave in the material for next week and see how we do. And yeah, anyway, good, wonderful. Thank you so much, all of you, for your engagement. I want to respect your time by trying to end punctually. And yes, please do feel free to write your hearts out there on the forum. And I'm staying on top of it as best I can and replying to things as I can. Be well, be well.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, bye.